Good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture, Creativity, Resilience and Freedom, Prison Art in Ming China by Ying Zhang, who is this semester's Nina Maria Gorrison Fellow in History here at the American Academy in Berlin. The Nina Maria Gorrison Fellowship in History was established in 2011 with the generous support of Nina von Malzahn and with a special focus on pre-19th century history is granted to 2 scholars per year. Dear Ying, it's an honor and a great pleasure to have you here at the Academy and to be able to get to know your research and your various interests. I will not introduce you tonight because we have someone here with us who is much more fitting to do this. But still, I would like to mention that one of the most striking aspects of your research and everything you do is that while we read so much about Sino-US relations, China in general, about the news, you truly give these discussions a human and a thoughtful face. You approach the topic from a variety of angles, for example, by including gender and sexuality in the debate, a very thorough historic focus, of course, there's no need that I have to elaborate on that. With your research, you carefully and constantly remind us about the human responsibility that we each have for each other, and thank you for that. And now it's my great pleasure to turn to Tristan Brown, who will not only introduce Professor Yang and also moderate the Q&A session afterwards, but who is also one of the best dinner conversations I ever had. He basically just a couple of minutes ago assured me that he only came to the American Academy because the food is so good. And when he's not eating, this is not an insult to you. When he's not eating, Tristan Brown is an assistant professor for social and cultural history of late imperial and modern China at MIT History. He's working on his first book right now, which is an investigation to the uses of cosmology in imperial Chinese law. Currently, he's also a visiting postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, pretty much around the corner in Dahlem. Tristan has held research fellowships at St. John's College in Cambridge, as well as Stanford University, and he has conducted research in China, in Taiwan, and Jordan, with the support of grants and fellowships from the British Academy, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, and the Henry Luce Foundation. Tristan, let me thank you again for agreeing to be part of this evening tonight and to help us do that. It's really, it's also a great honor, and you're the perfect fit to do this. Before Tristan will introduce Ying, let me briefly introduce how this evening will work tonight. We will have the introduction right now, then Ying will deliver her lecture. Then we will have the two of them in conversation, and you all here also have the possibility to ask questions. And for those of you who are joining us via Zoom tonight, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, to type in your questions. And Tristan will make sure to address these questions as well. And with that, and without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Vice President Ebert. I really appreciate it. Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. I guess on behalf of the American Academy of Berlin, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ying Zhang, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Institute for Chinese Studies at The Ohio State University. Let me begin by saying that one of the most amazing things about being in Berlin this year is the opportunity to meet and spend time with so many researchers from different institutions and disciplines, and that's such a special thing. I've had a great pleasure of finally getting to know Professor Zhang this year, although I've long enjoyed her work in print. So it's always amazing when you read somebody and then you meet somebody. That feeling is really special. So let me just take a few brief moments to introduce her scholarship. Professor Zhang has published on a great range of many different topics, and it's difficult to do her work justice in just a few words, but I will try. Her research spans the early modern period of China's history with a remarkable breadth of knowledge, of sources about the era, from the era, and a knack for bringing together a diverse base of sources of including dynastic histories, calligraphy, fiction, poetry, personal memoirs, and so forth. You get a taste of that, I'm sure, tonight. Professor Zhang's work explores the ways gender, religion, and print culture influence governing institutions in surprising and in important ways, whether during a dynastic transition or in the context of today's talk on prison life. Her first celebrated book, very celebrated book, Confucian Image Politics, Masculine Morality in 17th Century China, rethinks political rhetoric around Confucianism at the end of the Ming Dynasty in the 17th century, tackling an era of heightened political factionalism and the emergence of a flourishing print culture, somewhat like today's social media in some ways, I think. The book powerfully documents the forces that weaponized morality discourses in politics, particularly at a time of political instability. I think particularly impressive for me, and I'm sure many others here, is the fact that Professor Zhang's work always speaks to broader themes. And we'll see that today, showing us time and time again why the Ming Dynasty still matters and why the history of the Ming Dynasty is good to think with, right? It's just wonderful to think about all different types of questions. So I suspect we'll see another example of that today. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Ying Zhang.
Can you hear me? Good. Just making sure the mic works. Thank you so much, Barrett, and thank you so much, Tristan, for the generous introduction and the kind words. Means so much to me. And to meet with so many scholars here whose work I admired and learned so much from over the years. And especially because I started as a hardcore political historian trying to prove myself as a gender scholar, getting to hard politics. And in this process is the historical sources. It is the historical subjects own experience that have led me into topics such as religious studies and art. So to the colleagues here who are known for your research on religion, art, I really owe much to you, and also I hope to receive feedback and a conversation, have a conversation with you afterwards. This is such a humbling experience to share my research with such a wide range of audience. So scholarship at the intersection of prison arts, prison studies and art has resonated strongly with me since I began working on my book on jailed officials in Ming China. I studied their experiences to explore new ways to write about the administrative, legal, political, and social history of pre-modern China and its modern legacy. Although my research on Ming China intends to answer specific questions in Chinese history and historiography, I also feel it is possible and perhaps urgently necessary to look at its potential for exploring universal questions such as freedom and unfreedom. I've seen a lot of prisons, including this prison in Greece, the prison of the monks, to think about these very, very intriguing questions of freedom and unfreedom. Prison art offers a unique analytical perspective. An example from contemporary US can be seen in Nicole Fleetwood's award-winning book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. This book explores how prisoners themselves think about their experiences in this dehumanizing system. This particular illustration on the slide is one of my favorite included in her book. The portrait of the prisoner artist juxtaposes the refuge offered by art and a sharpened sense of unfreedom. This is one of the main points I hope to show in today's presentation. A new understanding of art in the prison context raises important questions about the nature of confinement. In Marking Time, Fleetwood analyzes the photographs taken by prisoners and their families when they visited the facilities. Such photos are often shot against fake nature backgrounds. And her analysis of the emotional richness and the strange aesthetics of prison photography exposes the reality of imprisonment. It is a punishment of the families and communities, not just a punishment of the individuals, as we're told. My research actually shares this insight. Of course, the art forms I look at in the Ming prison context are different. I look at mostly music, calligraphy, and painting, and not as much about making painting, but a lot about painting appreciation, and I will explain why its significance. I use the art of living as my main analytical framework in order to place religion at the heart of the prisoners' artistic activities, such as Caesar music, calligraphy, and painting. These art forms all involved the educated man's pursuit of self-cultivation, efforts to understand the nature of life, and align life with the cosmological transformations as manifested in nature and in this world. This is also key to understanding Chinese religion in general. So appreciating painting is an exercise of self-cultivation that they're all familiar with. And as you can see on the screen, this is a painting from the Ming Dynasty showing a group of scholars appreciating a painting. However, the painting itself forms a very interesting conversation with the background, the nature itself. You can see the similarity between the painting itself and nature. So this is a familiar exercise of self-cultivation for these people. And that's why painting appreciation in prison was also a meaningful spiritual experience for them. So here I'm showing you a prison poem composed by someone after he returned some paintings to an inmate. He brought the paintings to see in prison. And the poem reads, "Pine trees swing thin windows, shadows under the moon. Bamboo whisper into the gentle wind. I am so pleasantly intrigued. What is the use of drawings and paintings?" The first two lines actually describe the view he could see from his prison window. And he's pleasantly intrigued. Nature occupies a very special place in the educated man's self-cultivation in the Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist traditions. The jailed elites extended their reflection on the relationship between observing nature and enlightenment from their studio to the prison space. Of course, the material conditions of a confinement and unfreedom give this exercise a new context. On the slide, I'm showing an installation by the famous Chinese artist, Xu Bing, who was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin years ago. In this installation, in Suzhou, where the Ming Garden became very popular and famous in the Ming, he placed a traditional style landscape painting in a hall in front of the windows that imitate the famous Ming Suzhou Garden wall. I see this installation as a contemporary artist engagement with the literary theories about nature and enlightenment. This example of Ming prison art appreciation and its spiritual significance shows that not only do we need to rethink the meaning of art in prison, we also need to rethink the meaning of religion in this context. In scholarship on imprisonment and religion, we often hear about the so-called enlightened prisoner, how confinement contributes to a heightened religious sensitivity, and how religion helps the prisoner cope with the hardships. One of the scholars I met when I started writing this book, after I started writing this book, and who has published on this topic in religious studies is Joshua Dobler, a associate professor of religious studies at University of Rochester. He published a book, an ethnographic research on a prison in Pennsylvania, in which he discusses a wide range of religions that prisoners were allowed to practice in that Pennsylvania prison. And after I read the book, I couldn't help but noticing that all the religions I study were missing from the list. And also I couldn't help but wondering if the prisoners, if they are allowed to attend services and study scriptures, do they really enjoy religious freedom in that context? But if we look at the traditions in Chinese religion, the answer would be no. I argue that if we understand the Chinese religion as lived, then it is hard to support a claim that incarceration does not violate an individual's religious freedom. We find many poems written on important days when people were expected to perform rituals to align their living spaces with cosmological changes, a quintessential part of the Chinese religious practice across social strata. As I will show in the following example, the prisoners' creative activities served ritual purposes, but were inadequate. On this slide, I'm showing a poem composed by someone called Zheng Man on the 5th day of the 5th month, what we call Duanwu Festival in Chinese. The poem reads, "1 year ago, the prison became my sickbed. Encountering the festival once again, loneliness thickens and thickens. Half of my life meaninglessly spent. I've aged too soon. A strand of sadness slowly arises toward the lengthening summer sun. From afar, I watch in awe the dragon boat racing fast, and poignantly the burned mugworts with their dissolving scent. Till which day may this poor official prolong his life? Live or die, hollyhocks keeping their heart open to the glorious sun." So you may have noticed the dragon boat racing here. Yes, indeed, it is one of the most important rituals performed collectively on this day. Other family and community rituals included burning mugworts to dispel demons and diseases. This prisoner, Zheng Man, only had incense. He also composed a poem, a ritual that ritualized this day. But without the freedom of movement, he couldn't participate in those important rituals as a member of a family or as a member of the community. Prison poems like this one, though showing the creativity and resilience of the poet, paradoxically highlights the inadequacy of poetry. In other words, ritualizing these moments with poetry alone made them feel even more strongly the impact of unfreedom on their spirituality. The ritual space for this day, this particular festival, would have been ideal if there were also paintings properly chosen and displayed to form a cosmologically aligned environment. According to a book on the art of living in the Ming, educated men should hang medieval paintings with themes such as hollyhock flowers and dragon boat race to rearrange their living space in accordance to seasonal changes. And these paintings on the screen from the Palace Museum in Taipei and Palace Museum in Beijing were actually from medieval period, would have been ideal for such an occasion. Occasionally, jailed men have access to ritual paintings, for example, portraits of deities and gods, but it happened rarely and was very difficult to do properly and consistently in jail. So as the sample shows, the religious tradition I will be touching upon in this lecture are different from the ones we're familiar with. They included Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, other traditions, cults, and practices, and many of them actually synthesized certain aspects of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. By the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese religion had become so pluralistic and synthesized that the same ritual expectations could be found in many traditions. For example, performing rituals to the ancestors and the senior family members on important festivals on 5th day of the 5th month, 9th day of the 9th month, and the New Year's Day. So before I present more examples on prison art, I would like to provide a little bit of historical context. The main subjects of my study are classically educated officials, their families, and their communities. According to the administrative law of the Ming, if an official was accused of a crime, a misconduct, or job failure, he would be investigated. During this time, he would stay in jail, although there were some exceptions, and we can talk about it during the Q&A. At the end of the investigation, he would receive one of the following punishments or verdicts: exoneration and going back to work as if nothing happened, or loss of status and position, or financial redemption of physical punishment, or exile, or worst, execution. Theoretically, confinement was not a punishment, although this procedure was often manipulated and abused. There were 4 main jails in Beijing where these officials were held: the jails at the Ministry of Punishment, the jail at the censorate, jail at the Court of Judicial Review, and the notorious Imperial Prison. And here you're seeing an image of the Forbidden City in today's Beijing, and the jails were located just outside of the Imperial Palace complex. So the history of jailing as an administrative legal procedure has not received the proper scholarly attention. It is often written as part of political history of the Ming Dynasty, which failed to transform itself into something more modern. In this presentation, I will not focus on this part of my research, but my study of the institutional history and the political history of the Ming serve the same purpose as I study the topic I share today, that is to study the institutions and the lives of the people and their communities on their own terms. And the prison art serves as a great entry point. So what was it like to live in a Ming jail as official? Fang Zhenru once wrote 8 poems, a set of 8 poems. Each poem is dedicated to one awful condition in prison. And I list 5 of them here: crowded toilet, noise of a night watcher's drum, leaking roofs, floors covered with salty water, and flooding. And there were some others. So, and in another prisoner, Zhou Yi, wrote an essay on the bricks in prison. And I just read a small part of it. There are 2 big bricks in my prison cell. I collected some smaller ones and laid them at the bottom, and then placed the big one on the top to make a table. From morning to night, I read there and eat there. The bricks offer me so much. After a while, I began to think a lot about them. Bricks are junzi, aren't they? The junzi are the Confucian ideal gentleman. So he started, he creatively built a table with the bricks in prison. This really describes the dire situation, material situation there. But then he started to ascribe these ideal Confucian masculine virtues to the bricks. So Qian Jingyi, another jailed official, once used a metaphor of a honeycomb to describe the life and space in jail. It was not spacious. It's all kind of people: prison guards, other staff, prisoners, visitors, servants, and even peddlers who carry the coal and food into prison. They all busied through the narrow alleys. I think I really like this metaphor. It really vividly describes the mundane life in jail. Unlike the modern prison, it was not close to the outside world. There was much movement within this dynamic space. Prisoners, unless they were put in special cells and closely watched, often visited one another freely, socialized, and appreciated art together. And this is the context in which we're talking about these artistic activities and exchanges. So now back to prison art. The first art form I'd like to discuss tonight is music. On top of the slide is an image from the Metropolitan Art Museum showing a very precious zither or qin instrument. This was actually owned by a Ming prince in the mid-17th century. At the bottom are 2 illustrations from a zither book published in 1611. The illustration on the left shows the finger positions of the zither player imagined in connection with nature, things in nature such as birds, the movement of the birds, and then the flowers falling from the tree along with wind into water. So that's how he imagined the finger positions. And then the other illustration shows how to properly carry the instrument and notice the environment. There are pine trees, running water, a tiny bridge. Okay, so the zither playing mobilizes many senses and activates imagination to achieve its artistic and spiritual goals in self-cultivation, which is why in the main, it was supposed to be played outdoors in a mountain, a garden, or near an old pine tree while burning incense. So here I'm showing a poem composed by a musician and a jailed official. He was very passionate about zither playing, and his brother was a composer, and his family also collected precious instruments. The poem reads, and he composed a poem playing zither in prison. Zither sings within the compounds of stone walls. Prison cells resound only with beautiful tones. Forceful as a gallant man singing his lofty ambitions, gentle as a maiden's chanting her longing. In the leisurely tune of the mountain streams resonates the song of the sage king. Remember the drunken poet Bai Juyi listening to the pipa playing? The tears not wet his garment. So mountain stream is a very famous zither music and still being played today in China. The poem reveals how a highly educated Confucian man mobilizes spiritual resources to ground himself in such a situation. Music is a universal medium of communicating feelings, be it the sorrow of a singing girl or a harmonizing sensibility of the scholar. This highly personal process is what the Confucians have been trained to do in their self-cultivation. However, the reality of the stone walls weighs heavily. The prisoner does not mention any of the elements that would have made this a proper setting for zither playing. So what constitutes a proper ritual space for zither playing? Earlier, I've already mentioned some environmental elements. And this main painting, entitled Playing the Qin or Zither in a Secluded Valley, actually depicts the ideal environment for zither playing. As the inscription to the painting, right? 10,000 layers lofty mountains are presented to the cultivated eye. 1,000 feet of cascading falls cleanse the dusty heart. May the harmonies of my red string tune be the humble answer to the pine wind's ancient sound. This painting typifies how a zither player and Taoist visualize self-cultivation. And the painting actually shows the spiritual journey of the player, the zither player, and his ideal friend or soulmate, and the viewer of this painting. And this type of composition of the painting visualizes that spiritual journey. And here's a larger image of the zither player and his ideal friend or soulmate. And notice how prominent the pine trees and the running water are in this image. These are important, as will the show in the next poem, composed by another prisoner. He listened to an inmate playing zither, and then he recorded the experience. And I will play a small clip of this particular tune that's entitled Transformation and Ascendance of an Immortal. This was a Taoist themed new tune, actually just published 2 years before these guys got into prison. So it's pretty recent composition. Before I play this clip, very short clip, I'd like to read his poem because it really visualized the spiritual journey. The handbell has barely chimed with inmates' night chanting when the tune of purity makes a sudden visit to prison. One note and a second, ripples between mountains and streams. Up and down, the immortals flutter with their phoenix and cranes. I sit here and listen, eyes closed and mind emptied. In an undisturbed mountain, pine nuts are dropping. My feelings are taken to the realm of nothingness, nowhere else to seek deeper meanings. I recommend when you listen to the music, either you close your eyes or stare at the painting. Let me play this. I wish I could play a little bit more, but this is a pretty long song. And that the poem actually helps illustrate this mental and a spiritual process. That these are playing, listening, and the poetry together show how these jailed men drew on art to pursue their self-cultivation in those challenging conditions. Meanwhile, the tension between the materiality and the transcendence inherent in the Confucian and the Taoist traditions was amplified in jail. These men pursued transcendence, but the process required some material conditions that are missing. It's not difficult to imagine how a Confucian gentleman might struggle to create a proper ritual space for playing the zither. And now you probably can understand why the other man composed a whole essay to praise the breaks, because this is very spiritually very important. So I only have textual records like this to reconstruct how the jailed officials played music. Many other creative activities couldn't be reconstructed, preserved either. But calligraphy, which is more easily transmitted, can be preserved. And therefore we have some examples, and that's the art form I will look at next. The best example of prison calligraphy is by Huang Daozhou, a jailed official in the early 17th century. He was known for his very adventurous experiments with different brush styles, and some of them very, very expressive, and he's very curious about weird Chinese characters too. So he went to jail to be investigated for alleged factionalism, a serious political crime. The interrogators sensed that the emperor's anger at him and used the torture to make him suffer. However, he doubled down on his belief in Confucianism in jail by expressing it through his famous calligraphy. He hand copied the Confucian classic of filial piety 120 times in prison. And he chose this regular script, which is very accessible, very easy to decipher, to hand copy this classic. And he gave some copies to prisoners to be circulated outside. And he also gave some copies to prison staff, and some of them sold them for good price. So the copies, the prison copies are actually numbered, and this one I highlighted is number 17. He did in prison. They were numbered to demonstrate his deepening understanding of the Confucian ideal of filial piety and loyalty, the two important masculine ideals. During this time of confinement, he used his own blood to write the last copy of this. It was almost like a grand finale of the whole project. His rendition of this classic with his own blood in the final copy resonated strongly with a public fascinated by such an extreme action to authenticate one's piety. As scholars have pointed out, blood writing, which was practiced by Buddhists, Taoists, and Confucians, and represented broadly in all art forms in early modern China, was not merely a symbolic behavior, it was transformative. It transformed the text, it transformed the calligraphy, it transformed the calligrapher, and also transformed the owner of the copy. It was very powerful. That's why some of the political documents written in the Ming were in blood. This kind of brownish character is a little gross, but you get a sense about what it looks like. So this project, hand copying this many times in prison by this calligrapher, was thus a loud criticism of the emperor, who disagreed with him on the interpretation of filial piety loyalty in real world politics. But for the ordinary folks, such as prison guards who got a copy from him. His prison calligraphy was believed to generate magical power. So this is a piece of woodblock with which Huang's prison calligraphy was printed. And that's the image of the woodblock today in the Zhangpu, his hometown county museum. And this would be like what it was like to be printed and distributed. So his work became the most sought after items among collectors in the 17th century. After his death in a violent regime change, Huang became deified by a popular cult. It was actually a rebellious cult, although he was very loyal. These men in this rebellious cult would meet in a Buddhist temple where they hand his calligraphy on the top, this image. Also his prison calligraphy has been printed and distributed by a shrine in Taiwan. They were established by migrants from Fujian to Taiwan. Many of them are fishermen and maritime merchants. They worshipped him as a maritime and military deity, which had nothing to do with his career. They just wanted his protection. And his calligraphy still carries the protective power even today. So calligraphy as part of the Chinese art of living, thanks to the centrality of religion, plays a very important part in shaping the relationship between the Confucian-educated elite and ordinary folks. It met the jailed officials' spiritual needs and connected them to the social and cultural fabric of the broader world. Actually, I'm going to show this, talk about this example first. So this is a poem inscribed on the folding fan at the request of prison guard. Although the folding fan has not survived, the poem has survived. So we get a sense about its social and the spiritual significance. The poem reads, "Around the official suddenly enters confinement. Even Yafu submitted to the power of prison warden. Benevolence weighs 1,000 gold in this place. Master Yu's grandeurs stand as a testimony." The poem expresses an imprisoned official's gratitude toward the recipient of the artwork, the prison guard, who could have made his life a lot easier. But the significance of this calligraphy must be appreciated at the intersection of Confucian historical practice, popular religion, and art. The long history of imperial China had immortalized the famous official prisoners, such as Zhou Yafu, referenced in the second line. And the Confucian style official history also promoted the ideal image of prison guard, which is represented by Master Yu in the reference in the fourth line. Master Yu in the Ming Dynasty had his own shrine. He was worshipped in his own shrine, and he also appeared in the Taoist canon, the book of hidden virtues of imperial sovereign Wen Chang, who's still being worshipped today. You can see an image of him, and there's a shrine dedicated to him. So this Taoist canon, with examples of such as Master Yu, teach the importance of accumulating merits by doing good things, such as treating prisoners nicely. So this inscription, the poem, and the calligraphy together turned the folding fan into an auspicious object that carried the blessings of a noble gentleman. And this was very important for prison guards because they believed they know their profession was not so good, and they worshipped a lot of different prison deities and gods, and the blessing from these jail gentlemen meant a lot to them. That's why this folding fan with the calligraphy was so important. And this is also why the prison guards wanted a jailed official, Yang Jisheng, to contribute poetry on the New Year's Day. He actually documented it. On the New Year's Day, the jail makes its own lanterns with plain paper. Jail staff feel they're not decorated enough, so they ask me to contribute poetry. So this is an image of his calligraphy. I couldn't find any one that was done in prison, but you can see his style. And on the left is a small part of section of a painting depicting the imperial palace celebrating the new year. And you can see different styles of lantern. They are made with plain paper, but colorfully decorated with different patterns. So because the prison guards believed the calligraphy of these jailed officials carried protective power, magic power, and having this contribution to the decoration of the lanterns on the New Year's Day was a blessing for them. It was really spiritually meaningful for the prison guard. However, His own spiritual needs during the important festival were not met. The Chinese, I probably know, are supposed to perform a series of familial and communal rituals over a span of 3 weeks, such as ancestor worship, offering to parents and senior members of the family, and perform different kinds of rituals to different gods and deities. So calligraphy that carried religious meanings due to its transmissibility plays a very important role in jailed officials' social life. In the last example of my presentation, we can see how it helped jailed officials' families network in and beyond the prison walls. So Zheng Man, the jailed official, he printed a very precious calligraphic rendition of the Diamond Sutra before he went to jail. And he carried this Diamond Sutra with him to jail. I heard that Oxford University Museum has a copy of this. I'm still trying to track it down. Here, I can only show you something similar done by a very famous calligrapher from the Ming Dynasty, the calligraphic rendition of the Diamond Sutra. So Zheng Man composed an essay to describe why he gave it away. And he met an old friend, a family friend. These two families had known each other for a long time. Guo Zhaofeng. He said, Guo Zhaofeng and I often sat by the dim light in prison, and we look at each other emotionally. He told me that his mother and wife both observe vegetarianism and recite the Diamond Sutra every day. So I had my copy of the sutra sent to his mother. And his wife learned that my concubine Liang was living nearby in the capital. She gave my concubine a copy of the Heart Sutra, handwritten by herself. Her excellent calligraphy reminds one of Madame Wei, whose brushwork rivals that of Wang Xizhi. My concubine, in turn, gave Guo's wife a copy of the Diamond Sutra. So all these women were excellent calligraphers. The multiple exchanges between these two families via these calligraphic renditions of Buddhist sutras constituted mutual support on many levels. Reciting the Diamond Sutra was very popular among Ming women. They believed that this action would bring about miracles when the family encountered serious challenges. Women's material, artistic, and religious networking outside of the walls also testifies to the reality that imprisonment required a whole family to mobilize its human, material, and religious resources to support those in confinement. And for those men in jail, the Buddhist Sutra was not just an artistic religious text for their own enlightenment and salvation. It embodies the familial and social bonds damaged by the barriers of the prison wall. I hope this presentation has shown how the study of Ming prison art can shed light on some of the questions that concern all of us. The Chinese religion was deeply embedded in everyday family and social life. Ming prisoners' artistic activities reveal how the material environment in jail forced them to adapt their religious practice. The creativity of the prisoners demonstrates human resilience. In the meantime, it also sheds light on the profound spiritual desperation caused by the conditions of unfreedom. Studying the history of imprisonment comparatively has turned me into an abolitionist, I have to admit. I benefited tremendously from scholarship on US mass incarceration. And I'm surprised by how much my research findings can help me understand the problems of mass incarceration in the United States today. And from people in Germany, I've learned art is an important part of the civic discourse here. And you're making efforts to try to integrate art into prison design. I'm really looking forward to learning more about your efforts in Germany. Thank you so much.
A lot of the assumptions we make today cannot be applied back in the past, right? You know, that they're very different landscapes. And what is so interesting when we look at Chinese legal history, right? And we like approach this subject, for instance, from that lens. A lot of people don't talk about prisons, right? I think you mentioned this, right? Prisons are almost completely absent, right, from our discourse in the historiography. And the reason is simple, right? If you look at, I assume, the Great Ming Code, certainly the Great Qing Code, and you look at all of the punishments for various crimes, you really don't see time in prison being a kind of punishment, right? So one of the fascinating things that I think you're really bringing to the whole field's attention is that, well, you know, for officials and for other people, of course, who were accused of crimes, they were contained, right, in a place, right? These were real places, right? And we had a chance to talk earlier today before dinner. And of course, like officials kind of had their own containment centers, right? Ideally for officials, but sometimes I guess some non-officials were also in those spaces. But you know, like this is drawing attention to a major, you know, like lacuna in the field, right? And I think that it is so interesting to think about the fact that this topic is possible, right? That if you add up, you know, none of these folks, I assume, were in prison for years and years and years. They were waiting for some sort of, you know,
the longest one was 38 years.
38 years, oh my goodness. So some of them were really long.
Yeah, and this is something that intervention that I hope to do through my work. Thanks to this environment provided by the economy, I finished a draft of this book, and I actually problematized the division between jail and prison in prison historiography. Traditionally, we believe that you know, modern prison you know, use imprisonment as a punishment. In pre-modern times, it was a holding pen. But if you look at these men's experience, that line is really blurred. Sometimes they were experienced as imprisonment, and I have a whole chapter talking about you know, how they experienced as punishment and how it was believed to be a punishment. So there's this difference between what the law says or what we believed that was the common practice across pre-modern societies and how it was experienced and understood by people at the time. But that's an excellent point about whether imprisonment was officially or legally a punishment. This is a very important distinction, actually.
It is an interesting distinction, and it's fascinating how the kind of the details that shine through your presentation and your work, you get the sense, which is not surprising, you know, when we think about political activities today, that when some of these officials were detained, people knew about it. Right. I mean, these were some prominent officials, right? And that, you know, their works, their calligraphy, right? People knew that they were no longer working as officials, right? So they think about the circulation, right, of some of their artistic work and just the, you know, that whole sort of discourse of like, what does it mean, right, for an official to be taken out of the position and placed into a place like this?
So another intervention that I'm hoping to make is to think about the meaning of political prisoner. So there's in the historiography, there's some scholars argue that political prisoner is a modern phenomenon. I think that's debatable, and we have to define what we mean when we say this political prisoner. Do they have to be the center of a political campaign to be considered a political prisoner, or is it something else? This is one of the questions we have to talk about across disciplines.
I mean, that really struck me. And the other thing that really struck me, which I want to make sure that everybody in the room can appreciate this point, because it's really an interesting point to think about, is who were officials, right, in Ming Dynasty China, right? So these were people who studied a curriculum, passed many examinations, were really educated people, right? And would have been familiar with calligraphy and, you know, many of these things that we associate with literati culture of the Ming and Qing periods of the late imperial era. And so in a way, when they get placed into these prisons, they're no longer officials, but they're still scholars. And that sort of identity, right, that they're cultivating that identity, that is the agency that they still possess in this place. And I think that you show that so well of you know, giving us this just totally unvarnished insight, right, into the lives of these individuals. I just want to make sure that everybody got that point, because it's really interesting to think about. The other point that I want to make sure that we get to is religion, right? Because this is such a rich topic in Chinese history, and certainly this is the first I've ever heard, right, of, you know, like, you know, Buddhist sutras being copied in these places and everything like that. I think the one thing to stress, right, just to make sure that everybody, you know, I'm sure many of you in the audience know this, is that, you know, religion in China is not identitarian, right? In the sense that, you know, people can participate in Taoist stuff and Buddhist stuff, you know, very freely. You know, it's not in the sense of all or nothing. You're just one thing. And that, of course, you know, really comes out in the examples that you give. The other thing that strikes me that I have encountered before is the idea of the prison as a kind of ritual space, right? Prison deities. You know, prisons, you know, of course, Judge Bao and shrines to Judge Bao around prison spaces. So I'm curious, you know, I'm curious to kind of ask you a little bit more about, you know, you know, in addition to, for instance, the fact that it is striking in this work that these incarcerated individuals have the ability to do all this stuff, right? They can do music, they can do art, they can do some religious stuff, right? So that in itself is a fascinating point. But I'm curious to, you know, to just ask you about, like, what do you think this tells us about religion in China, right? Or religion in the Ming Dynasty?
It was everywhere.
Yeah.
It was part of everyday life. It's not separated from everyday life. And I think that's something I really wanted to stress, and which is why I think I might be wrong. And those of you who are more familiar with American, you know, system, for instance, and how they think, how they process these requests to practice a particular religion in American prisons, maybe can tell me more about it. But I really feel that because prison religion in the Chinese context is so lived in everyday life, actually, I think probably most of the religions we share these days in modern society and also lived, right? So then what defines religious freedom in the prison context? If we say prisoners can enjoy religious freedom, so, but if religion is lived, then we're basically taking away some of their, you know, religious freedom, right? Yeah. By not allowing them to practice in everyday life, which is, you know, impossible without the movement, the freedom of movement. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely, and it was striking to me in the context of the presentation, you know, and I'd be curious to ask you a little bit more about, you know, what these spaces look like, as much as that we can reconstruct them, because it does seem to me from what you were talking about that people freely, you know, got up and talked to each other. There were multiple people in the space, you know, so it was kind of like, you know, maybe if I could ask you a little bit about this,
of course,
to just fill us in, you know, onto like, what did these spaces look like? You know, what was the physicality of them? Because I think especially that question, when today we have so much baggage, right? We have such a kind of strong image when it comes to what a jail is. So just maybe give us a little sense of like what these places were.
Well, pre-modern world was hard. Life was very hard to begin with, and the prisons were more miserable, I think, in terms of physical conditions than probably most modern prisons that are allowed to exist. I didn't want to borrow these images available today because they were pretty stereotypical and from more maybe 19th century and from a province. I didn't want to mislead the audience by using those images, but they were dark, dark and very wet. And the seasonal changes are often mentioned in the prison poetry precisely because not only because they have to do all these things in accordance with the seasonal changes, but also it really affected the quality of their life. I've written about their health, which is affected by rain, by hot weather, by the cold weather, all these miserable conditions in jail. And the jail, it's, so there's violence in jail and someone could walk to a cell to talk to a friend and also beat up someone who he knew and hated outside of prison. So all kinds of things, wild things were happening in jail among these well-educated men. So it's less controlled, I guess, than we imagined, but a lot of tragedies happened because the poor condition in pre-modern times, the illnesses caused some deaths. So prison is notorious for deaths, these kind of deaths, and that's why all the officials, their job evaluations, how many jail people you're let out, that's one of the job evaluation criteria at the time. That's how miserable it was, the jailing of the people, because this process, legal process, could go on for a long time. Yeah.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up on that. In terms of the class dimensions, right? Because of course we have like, if commoners who get, they do some crime and they get detained for a while, these are officials. So would the conditions of these, kind of like in Beijing, the imperial prison, be a little better or not?
Well, I've not, I would say not a whole lot, by a whole lot. Right. Prison was prison. It was bad, and the they were not clearly separated. It's basically the open space, but people understood sort of the where the better space began. So, but it was just as miserable, I would say, and you read this repeatedly in historical documents.
No, absolutely. Well, I want to, give people a chance to sort of get their own questions in here. I mean, this is such a great talk. Absolutely. Please, over here. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, I was trying to get a handle on the sensibility of both the prisoner and the imprisoned, the jailers and officials, a sense of their own guilt. Are they in prison to be punished at like the torture and the inhumane conditions? Are they in prison to be isolated away from the population? Or is there some sense of being in prison for rehabilitation, for reaching the, climbing the mountain and becoming a better human being? And what is their own sense of being there? Is there guilt?
No, because it's just like jail today. They were there to be detained during an investigation, so they were not assumed guilty. But the investigation in pre-modern times could take a long time. They had these procedures like dispatching officials from different departments to where the crime supposedly happened to investigate. And they would come back and report and make a decision about whether this official should be punished or not. And the real punishment would be something else. So they didn't necessarily had a sense of guilt. They all claimed they were wronged, of course. But some of them were really they're murders. committed by these officials, and there were serious crimes committed by them. And not all of them deserve to be released, but many of them actually, after a couple of months of investigation, returned to their government positions because they were cleared. The prison guards, that's a great question, because occasionally they would use torture, especially if the case is a political case. The emperor just decided, I'm going to find an excuse to throw this man in prison and claim he made some kind of mistakes and deserve to be punished. So in some cases, they were tortured. And sometimes a powerful official will instruct, oh, give him a hard time, just, when he's in prison. So, and also because the jail is such a terrible place, and there are all kinds of problems occurring in it, these prison guards, prison staffs, they really felt bad about, serving there. And they really needed some kind of, like protection or blessing from God deities and these officials who they watch every day. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Good point. Yeah. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was really beautiful. And I love how you approach the huge issue of life in prison through art. And I wanted to ask you a little more about the kind of art part of your talk, because the four arts that the literati are supposed to be very good at seem very much in the foreground of your work. And we saw three of the four, right? And playing Go was the one that wasn't there.
Yeah.
And it makes total sense that there's less in it for us in learning about prison culture, but presumably they did play Go. And I could imagine that this could be a really important part for the community in establishing hierarchies and forging connections. Do we know anything about that, or is that sort of? Oh,
we do have evidence. I have sources about Go chess playing. It's the fourth arts that were practiced by these educated men, and they did document Go chess playing. It's sort of, if I remember correctly, it's about sort of imagining their bigger role in the world, be a general, and thinking about what they could do if they get out and things like that. So it was present, and yeah, that's a great question. I was actually surprised to see them playing like that. And one person played a lot of it to celebrate his own birthday. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for introducing us to such an unusual topic. Is there a sort of biography connected with some of them? And do we know why they were put in prison? Political reasons, religious reasons, corruption, or other crimes?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are. So I didn't talk about the reasons why these prisoners, these men were jailed, partly because there's so much moral judgment and bias in the historical sources we use. So I tried to compare different sources to make sure I understand the best, why one person ends up in prison and what happened to him. Yes, some of them were imprisoned for political reasons, but always with accuse of corruption and whatever. But there are many cases in which the man, for instance, failed to produce the right balance sheet if he's an official in the Ministry of Revenue, or maybe this person beat up a colleague, or some other misconduct, or caused a failure of a military campaign. So there are a lot of job-related problems associated with this detention. Many of these cases ended up quite nicely. The officials were cleared and they were released. And in some situations, they just lost their jobs, and sometimes they were exiled. So there's a wide range of reasons why they're imprisoned. And traditional historiography often describe these as just lumped together as like political prisoners, which is really not true. And we need to take this as a legal procedure very seriously so that we can really understand the institutional history. And actually you can trace the reforms they're trying to make sure they jail fewer people, because it was not a pleasant experience. And they lacked officials. Many of them ended up in jail. It's like, we don't have enough officials. We just need to let them out, stay out of prison during the investigation. There were efforts like this. This is a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. I basically have two questions, one about audience and one about the meaning of blood. I think they're related. So I'm wondering, for the poetry, the calligraphy, the music, different types of audiences and who they were trying to reach with their artistic works within, and I think what's even maybe more interesting, without, outside of the prison. And which brings me to the meaning of blood and the mixing of the blood for calligraphy. Like I've thought about blood in the history of Chinese calligraphy and following Jonathan Hull, I think his name is, about his extension of the individual through their, more abstractly, like the qi, their blood goes into the ink, and the calligraphy is a representation of the individual. But in listening to you talk, I thought there's other meanings of blood in this prison context, which I hadn't thought about before. So I really would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you so much, Marta, for the question. The blood, because it had already been associated with sort of the creative power you just mentioned, and kind of exorcistic power. His use of this, particularly in the prison calligraphy in the last copy, was very powerful. And I think it was a combination of different kinds of power in this case. And basically in this time, there were so many extreme manifestations, ways for these men to manifest their feelings and their especially political feelings and religious feelings, that they resort to this type of material or medium at the time. I think by this time, when he started to produce his prison calligraphy, it had become very widely practiced, especially in political petitions. Many of them are associated with the jailed father and things like that. And many of the political documents were written in that. And so much, it was practiced so widely that the emperor had to say, you gotta stop. This is not gonna convince me that you deserve to be released. And this is too extreme. And it started to be considered improper to do precisely because it's so powerful and it's so popular in the imagination of the ordinary people. It's magic power. Yeah. So what was the first part of your question?
I mean, it's about audience.
Yeah, the audience.
So
yeah.
really,
Yeah.
The blood calligraphy is reaching an audience beyond the
Yeah.
prison.
Yeah, I think it was some of the prison poetry was already printed, published when they were still in prison. So this was already, thanks to print culture, this was forming a kind of environment in which people can learn about their work, their art, and their experience in prison. So that's why I think this modern definition of political prisoner might be a little too rigid. It was already happening in this concept, in its context. And I think because you can only produce one, he basically was a finale, right? The final copy of the 120 copies of this classic. It couldn't be printed like that, but people heard about it and they imagined about it. So the story itself got really widely circulated through print culture at the time. So he actually had the audience outside of the prison in his mind. And as he was doing that, he was already distributing them. He made one copy and gave it away, made a copy, gave it away. Sometimes just, to friends and sometimes to just strangers. So he tried to make these, allow these to be circulated widely. He had the public in his mind.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for this moving. Yes? Very moving contribution. We have a much esteemed friend who's currently imprisoned in Hong Kong, and so we have a special thought for him today because he is there for the type of reasons that you explained. You said it very clearly, and but I think it's worth repeating that in traditional China, incarceration did not figure as a statutory punishment. It was essentially a penal system of law where this doesn't figure. So it really is a gray area of unregulated state coercion, which is, as you said, is routinely part of the investigation, the interrogation, and so forth. I was shocked to hear that it could last up to 38 years. I had no idea that it could be that serious. So I think this is very important what you said, and it's very original. I've never heard any discussion of this to this date.
Thank you.
On the other hand, an area which has been well studied and which is closely related is the poetry and art of exile, which is one of the statutory punishments. And when
Yes.
people then left on exile, often until the end of their days in very distant places, malaria infested southern swamps and things like that. This produced a very well recognized and important art in China, which is well studied. Do you at all make a link between these two?
Thank you so much for the question and the comments. Yes, actually, one of the first questions I received when I started to share my work with colleagues was about exile, poetry, and art. I'm very self-disciplined with this research. I stop when these men were released or exiled or demoted, because I only wanted to study this legal procedure and what happened when they were in jail. So I actually think this deliberate effort to isolate this process and artwork produced or activities in jail experience with imprisonment can form an interesting contrast maybe with the study of exile in such a poetry and art, because it's outside. So in what sense, to what extent they are similar experience, similar sentiment, sort of, imprisonment after all is in today or in, slavery, it's the social death, right? So to what extent they shared some characteristics and experiences, in what extent they were very, very different. I think, I really hope my work will invite new questions, new research topics. I have actually received questions like this several times now, and I think it's really worth exploring.
So quick follow-up on that, because I think the 38-year example is really striking, and I'm sure, and I just want to push you on. So what the typical, if we can say, right, was a couple of years. No. What was the typical?
So this is why we began with imagining I would do a quantitative research and ended up doing qualitative research because first of all, I thought I exhausted all the records. I had thousands of them. And then I realized there were so many more. As I read more biographies, local histories, and I just decided I'm not going to give the reader exact or even a number that's close. I don't want to mislead the readers. So I just decided I'm going to describe this range of scenarios and experiences. So one example is the duration of jailing. Its shortest could be just 1 or 2 days.
Right.
And the longest one I know so far is 38 years. And this one was a little strange because he was basically not jailed in Beijing. He was left in a provincial jail where he served as a head of the prefecture. He probably deserved some kind of punishment, but the case kind of just went nowhere. And nobody knew what to do with this case because there were all kinds of sort of narratives. And so he was left there, and his family were visiting him, and he educated his sons, and they all passed the highest degree and became officials. So in the 30 years, like a new generation of officials were produced in this family, continuing his career. So it was a very strange situation, but it's also revealing because legally he was still in the process of investigation. It just lasts for a long time, and nobody knew what to do with him. And he was not tortured. He was just kind of left there until the emperor died, and then he got out. Yeah. Yeah, it was not typical, but in some sense, it also shows some of these problems of the system. Yeah.
Do you get the sense, I mean, you know, I'll just say in Qing legal history, we get this kind of sense with the imperial review of capital punishments and things like this, that the emperors, I mean, especially in the revisionist history, right? That kind of, you know, if you can avoid the death penalty, that's ideal, right? Did you also see that in the Ming? With that in mind, you know, when do you see, you know, like the death penalty being enacted, right? Is it for these like really extreme cases? I mean, you know, officials committing murder and things like that. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, it's just one official who committed murder actually fled because this is a very interesting story because he actually, he was jailed and he was likely he would get a death penalty. And his colleague, because it was an open space, one of his colleagues decided, well, hey, they're actually not that close for some reason. This guy is just like, I want to say goodbye to this person. He got him out of prison and brought drinks, food, and this guy just took off. And then this person who wanted to treat him well before his death ended up in prison and died there. And this guy, 2 years later, he was found and arrested and sentenced to death penalty. He died there. So this is a very, very strange case. So there are cases like this, and there are also political cases in which, I mean, most of the political cases will not lead to death, but in some of the examples I've studied, because they're used as political chips, eventually, you know, a death sentence was issued. So I would say we just cannot assume every single official sentenced to death was a political prisoner. That's not the case, but there were some examples like that in my sources. So we really need a careful study, and I'm trying a careful study to at least start this process of understanding what was the practice at the time, what was political, what was legally done, and to get a better idea about how to assess the system. And then we can start from there.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Do you have a question? Yes.
Thank you, Ying. It's so elegant and so lovely. And I've been trying to think about your point about American religious freedom and its comparison. It strikes me that conception is so very Protestant. I mean, it's the idea is that you allow freedom so that the confession can come forth and then atonement can be received, and that will solve the problem at some level. It will create some kind of freedom of the soul in some way. Do you have any examples of people who confess or who want to confess? Is there any sort of structure in which it makes sense for anybody in these Chinese circumstances to say they were wrong, to say that they were guilty? Would that help, or would that never happen because it would never help your situation whatsoever? So
they all claim they were innocent.
They all claim they were innocent.
Yeah, but it's not that's not a part of the reason why they practice religion in jail. So this is a great question because it was not confessional. So therefore, it is really for the individual self-cultivation and to kind of about this life, right? I have a couple of examples who are Catholics, but I couldn't, because they were in prison in a very short period of time, they didn't leave much. So I do not have enough evidence to analyze whether their Catholic upbringing or their background had anything to do with the poetry, influenced the poetry they composed. I'm not saying that. And in terms of confession, so there had been sort of reflection on their own, what they got them into prison and whether it was worth it. And should they just continue their belief? I would say they're quite honest in their prison writing and prison letters. And some of them are just like, I really believe in this and I'm not wrong and I will continue even after I'm relieved. And like this man, he actually doubled down on his belief. There are others who started to question if their choices and their, the choices that got them into jail, and they regret it because some of their cases got others into jail as well, and they felt bad about that. So there are a lot of emotions reflected in their self-cultivation, like these writings in prison, but they're not necessarily related to this kind of enlightenment or prison that we're familiar with in the study of Western religion. And that's what I think makes this case so interesting to us. I hope I answered your question, Suzanne. Okay. Yeah, the only non-confessional, I mean, the particularly interesting case in Joshua Doubler's ethnographic work in this Pennsylvania prison was the Native Americans. And they got, after many attempts, they finally succeeded in getting the permission to practice in prison, sort of these rituals there, but still it's not like, what we're seeing these Ming prisoners about everyday life performing these rituals that related to sort of, cosmological changes and the everyday life community, everyday life rituals. It's quite different. Yeah.
Well, Ying, this was absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
It was so informative. The questions were excellent. And I'm sure, people are going to have more questions for you. And we all look forward to seeing this work go forward. It's really important. And it's really just creative, original.
Thank you so much.
Can't wait to see it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.